Ethiopians are currently at the polls for their general election, amidst a worsening security situation and in the shadow of numerous civil wars. Will this election bring a reprieve for Africa's second largest nation, or simply stir up the chaos? But first, welcome to the update brief. Please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and argue with me in the comments below. We'll start with the bottom line up front. Ethiopia's general election is taking place today on the 1st of June 2026. This is the 7th general election held under Ethiopia's current constitutional architecture, and there are many metrics which support the Prime Minister's assertion it will be the best election to date. Over 50 million voters have registered, of which half of which are women, and there is a strong cohort of young voters in a country with a median age of 19. The almost 11,000 candidates and 47 parties vying for those votes are painted as a sign of a burgeoning and vigorous democracy. However, these stats are only the tip of a markedly less optimistic iceberg. 50 million registered voters sounds impressive, but the population of Ethiopia is approximately 132 million, and there's no guarantee that even a majority of those 50 million registered will actually turn up to vote. Ongoing security issues have resulted in the country's constituencies being rated each on a red, amber, green scale for security. Areas rated red are simply not holding elections, and additional security mitigations, which may suppress the vote, are being implemented in those rated amber. The denial of electoral rights to whole swathes of the country is unlikely to calm the numerous armed factions which exist in opposition, if not always outright conflict with the government. An entire electoral cycle without representation, should voting be suspended for them today, is unlikely to suppress the sense of antagonism between them and the government, and also likely to provide avenues for external actors such as Eritrea and Sudan to exert their influence into those regions at the cost of central government authority. What is most likely is that the incumbent Prime Minister Abiy will retain his governing majority, but the stability of his majority is unlikely to represent stability for the nation as a whole. State of conflicts. Ethiopia as a country is not a nation-state in the European sense. Its national boundaries encompass and divide a wide array of distinct cultural and ethnic groups, stemming from a long-term cycle of expansion and contraction, starting for the Ethiopian Empire in about the 1300s, and then several periods of mass migration laid atop. It is reasonably expected these groups have, over centuries, engaged in their own Game of Thrones, and the resulting web of alliances, grudges, and mistrust form the underpinnings for a number of non-state armed groups scattered throughout the country. We'll start at the top with the obvious one. Top not only in the sense of the biggest problem, but also geographically based in the north of the country. The region of Tigray was the site of the most recent bout of open warfare in Ethiopia, with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, having fought the government from 2020 to 2022. The conflict also drew in troops from other regional armies to oppose Ethiopian federal forces, who were also supported by Eritrean, i.e. foreign troops. Detailed reporting was hard to come by at the time, but several NGOs in 2021 stated they considered the war an attempted genocide against the Tigrayan people. A settlement reached by the Prime Minister Abiy in 2023 resulted in the cessation of full-scale hostilities, but did not actually result in the disarmament of the TPLF or their integration into the state. Instead, a interim government authority was set up in the region, and the effect of that has been relatively limited. Non-state armed groups continue to vie for authority and power, with armed skirmishes over the control of strategic assets increasingly common coming into early 2026. More recently, in early 2026, the TPLF has reformed its Legislative Council, which was previously disbanded in 2023. This has essentially resulted in the creation of a shadow government underneath the interim regional authority, and while both the government and the TPLF state they wish to avoid war, this separation, this undercutting of each other, is going to result in a showdown in the near future. Coming on to the election itself and why this all matters, Tigray is one of the regions categorised as red in the current election and therefore will not be electing its full quota of representatives. It is almost certain that this sort of removal of democratic privileges, or rights, as you will, is going to exacerbate tensions between the official and shadow government structures in Tigray and the surrounding area, and also drive further support resistance against Addis Ababa. We then have Oromo, which is the largest geographical region ethnic group in Ethiopia. There's currently an organisation called the Oromo Liberation Army, which broke from the Oromo Liberation Front in order to continue armed resistance against the federal government following a peace agreement in 2018. Some fighters surrendered more recently in 2024 following a separate smaller peace agreement, but ultimately a significant number of fighters remain active. The group has a history of conducting massacres against ethnic Amhara communities, as well as general criminality, and according to their own admission, by phone intercepts targeting the group, there are 4 Oromo Liberation Armies. There's the real OLA, criminals who use the OLA for essentially an exercise in enhanced branding. The government infiltrators calling themselves the OLA as in sting operations, and naive recruits manipulated by the two false factions. So ultimately, OLA is a problem, but you're never quite sure if the OLA is the problem or the fake OLA is a problem. Either way, not a great time. In terms of the election, Oromo is much larger than Tigray. There will be areas across Oromo which cover the full spectrum of red, amber, and green statuses for electoral security measures. However, as with Tigray, it's almost certain that those areas with either suppressed for security purposes or just barred voting are going to result in experiencing higher levels of dissatisfaction and grievance in the immediate short term, and will not do anything to reduce support for many of the various OLAs. We've also then got FANO, which, unlike the rest, is not an acronym. It's a word that comes from the root word, an Ethiopian word for guerrilla in the general sense, but has now become synonymous with the Amharan ethno-nationalist movement. This organisation supported Ethiopian federal troops against the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front in the Tigray War, but since 2023 has switched back to its normal pattern of activity, conducting attacks and insurgency against the federal government. Unlike the OLA, which is heavily fragmented and appears to remain heavily fragmented, FANO appears to be centralising. A number of groups reportedly bound themselves more strictly into an Amharan FANO group, and have issued statements from participating in the election is an enemy of the Amharan people, and it is therefore likely this newly coordinated and centralised group will seek to disrupt electoral activity in the areas where it has significant influence. Managed democracy. Oh, sorry, it's not Super Earth. Prime Minister Abe first came to power in 2018, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 for his efforts to resolve the Ethiopia-Eritrea border conflict, and began a allegedly genocidal war against Tigray in 2020. In the 2021 general election, his Prosperity Party won 457 out of 473 contested seats in the House of People's Representatives. The remaining 74 seats, so up to a total of, I believe, 547, were not contested due to the security situation in their respective constituencies. And what this gives us essentially is the Prosperity Party having a Putin-esque level of legislative control. Now, if you're anything like me, when you see electoral percentages that start with a 9, we're immediately jumping to fraud, vote suppression, ballot stuffing, just outright lying, as our sort of assumption for how that came about. However, in this case, I have not seen any overt allegations of the sort of Russian-style vote stuffing. Rather, what we seem to be seeing is a situation where Ethiopia operates on a first-past-the-post system, and there's a very large number of parties. What this means is that the vote is split multiple ways, so you only need to be marginally larger than anyone else to have 100% of the power in any constituency and correspondingly in the legislature. We then also see the imposition of sort of less direct measures, so the imposition of security measures in the amber areas, or just the termination of voting in particularly high-risk areas as a method of denying legislative rights to areas that are unlikely to support the government. We can also take a slightly more cynical approach to this. Rather than seeing the 47 parties and 11,000 candidates as a sign of a vigorous and burgeoning democracy, we could see Prime Minister Abiy's release of political prisoners and his encouragement of a plethora of opposition parties as an intentional effort to fragment political opposition to set up a situation where he can roll through first past the post on a sort of marginal level. We've also seen ahead of this current election, just sort of proving the cynicism a little, where Prosperity Party is highly unlikely to win, there are significant reports that they have entered into negotiations with the most likely victor in that area to dial back Prosperity Party's campaigns and allow a selected opposition candidate to win in exchange for that opposition candidate essentially supporting Prime Minister Abiy in government. So we see a sort of co-opting of the opposition. Again, something you see a little slightly different flavour, but you see in Russia as well. Political debate itself is also heavily limited in a tightly controlled media environment. Reporters Without Borders ranks Ethiopia as 148th out of 180 countries, down from its much higher 145th place last year. Internationally recognised news agencies, including the BBC and Reuters, were denied renewed press passes earlier this year. And while press freedom has improved in a black letter law sense, a lot of censorship laws and things were reduced, and slander and libel laws were loosened to allow more freedom of speech. In practice, detention of critical journalists remains commonplace, and recently implemented terrorism legislation has incredibly broadly worded provisions with very arduous sentences, which have been used as a stick to beat journalists with. Again, something we see elsewhere, where terrorism is used as a cosh for freedom of speech, like true freedom of speech. Additionally, and something I guess we're very familiar with in the West as well, mis, dis, and malinformation is running riot in Ethiopia. The government's response to this, significant amount of which is generated by AI, is the creation of an official fact checker. However, this has actually just been used to circulate further pro-government propaganda and indeed pour fuel on the fire to messages that it sees as supportive of the government narrative. Combined, this is contributing to a breakdown in any concept of objective truth within Ethiopia, and consequently poisoning Ethiopian democracy at its roots. And as I said, I'm not saying we're doing much better over here. As such, I would argue that despite 47 parties and 11,000 candidates, it is not really clear how many Ethiopians are actually in a position to make an informed choice heading into this election, or whether their choice is actually much better than an illusion. So we now move on to external pressures and issues. There are two loose but opposed international blocs with keen interests in Ethiopia. We've got Sudan and Eritrea, supported at arm's reach by Saudi, Egypt and Turkey, and this bloc maintains close ties to the Tigray People's Liberation Front and other affiliated armed groups. The interests of each country in this bloc are not directly aligned, but Sudan and Eritrea in particular have an interest in disrupting a neighbour which has the second largest population and consequently massive military potential on the continent of Africa. Egypt further has an ongoing dispute with Ethiopia over the Grand Renaissance Dam, which controls the flow of water into the Nile and consequently controls the lives of almost every Egyptian citizen. Eritrea, obviously having won its independence from Ethiopia in the 90s, has a long-going military history there, and they currently have Eritrean forces operating overtly within the Tigray region of Ethiopia. This gives some legitimacy to Ethiopian government's concerns regarding Eritrea, and recently those two forces fought together against the TPLF and the OLA in Tigray. However, they've continued to stay in Tigray region after the peace agreement, and their continued presence without invitation is almost certainly a thorn that the Ethiopian government is going to try and pull at some point. It's also a plausible casus belli for the Ethiopian government to use if they wish to launch an intervention into Ethiopia to seize a Red Sea port. Ethiopia is the largest landlocked country in the world, and the loss of its Red Sea ports to Eritrean independence in the 90s is a thing that the government craves to redress. other bloc is headed by the UAE and Israel. Interests there are a general opposition to the Saudi and Egyptian bloc, and also the opportunity to use Ethiopia as a large, powerful, and populous staging base for their other interests in Africa. Through their support of the Ethiopian federal government, this bloc has provided armed support for the Rapid Support Force rebels in Sudan, who are obviously genociding their way through the country, and they are also alleged to have launched drones in support of the RSF from Ethiopian territory and conducted strikes with those drones across Sudan. Although these groups are opposed to each other in some respects, they have some interests in common. That interest essentially is in a weak and distracted Ethiopian government. The pro-TPLF faction obviously is just diametrically opposed to the Ethiopian government on principle. You've got Tigray looking for more independence, you've got Eritrea obviously having fought numerous wars with Ethiopia and wanting to keep them on the back foot, similarly with Sudan and Egypt. But with the UAE-Israel faction, there's also an interest there in maintaining friction within Ethiopia, because the less robust Ethiopia's internal power is, the more likely it is to become reliant on external support from the UAE and Israel, thus giving them leverage to expand their operations in Africa, etc., etc., etc. What this means is that both of these groups are likely to try and leverage the population's heightened emotions and any unrest in the aftermath of the election to get their claws deeper into Ethiopia. So that brings us on to the conclusion, which is not really a surprise to anyone. The Ethiopian election is almost certain to return a similar legislative breakdown to the current government, leaving Prime Minister Abiy's Prosperity Party with an overwhelming majority. However, the structural deficits around the election mean that the outcome of the vote is not going to lay outstanding issues to rest, rather the opposite. Further empowering Prime Minister Abiy is likely to feed his authoritarian tendencies, and consequently, unrest and conflict in the restive Tigray, Amhara and Amhara regions is likely to grow. Observers should expect to see the security situation in Ethiopia continue to degrade and outside involvement in the country continue to escalate. Anyway, that's all for today. If you enjoyed the episode, please press the like button or share it with someone who would also enjoy it. If you want to see more of my work, please subscribe to the channel and take a look at my previous episodes. And if you want to argue with me, you know where the comments section is. Sources listed in the video description. Peace out.